Father, Lord, we pray committing this gathering into your hands. You are the source of all knowledge, all wisdom, all understanding. Therefore, we cannot do without inviting you in this program. We pray, Lord, as students, Lord, the main purpose of our being here is to finish our thesis and on time. We pray, Lord Jesus, as we begin this seminar, let your knowledge, understanding, and wisdom abound in the life of each and every one. Grant us the grace to grasp the details of whatever will be discussed here, so that, Lord, it will be beneficial unto us. We know, O God, that as we have called your name, you will grant us all that we need, Father, to achieve this greater height. We bless your name. We commit the facilitator into your hands. We commit each member into your hands, O God. Grant us, Lord, your grace to learn and to understand. We pray that whatever the facilitator may need, the special guest may need, Lord Jesus, grant him so that he can impact onto us. We pray committing everyone here and those yet to join into your hands. We know that as we have begun with you, you will surely complete with us. We bless you, for we know that you are with us. In Jesus' mighty name, we pray with thanksgiving. Amen.
Amen. Amen. Amen. Thank you very much, Mr. Opoku, for your wonderful prayer. Other members, before we continue, I'll humbly request all chapter executive or national executives to kindly change your name to your portfolio so that you will be duly recognized and acknowledged. Please, with due respect, so that we can continue the program. Thank you very much for adhering to this. I'll humbly call on the president of Nugs-Beijing, Mr. Johnson Ejumaje, to give us the purpose of gathering as well as introduction of chapter executive and national executives. Thank you. Mr. President, please, you have the floor. Hello, Mr. President. Honorable Johnson. Hello, Honorable Johnson, please, can you hear me?
Can you hear me, please, now?
Yeah, we can hear you now. You have the floor.
Okay. Good evening, everyone. We thank God for this gathering. Just as the man of God, our brother who gave the opening prayer just said, as students, one thing that is required of us, even as we get to the latter part of our study program, is to present a paper, a thesis. And so the purpose of this gathering is to listen to our eminent professor in our midst, who tonight is going to coach us on how to write or present a thesis. So that is the purpose for this gathering. On this note, I want to introduce some members, leaders from the national executives, NUGS-CHINA. We have our national president, Mr. Colin Say, and all his entourage, his national executives. We want to welcome you very much. And also leaders from all chapters, president, vice president, and all other leaders, we want to acknowledge your presence. We are so much grateful for being part of this program. We also want to introduce executives of Nugs-Beijing. First to myself, the president for Nugs-Beijing, Mr. Edumazi Johnson. Welcome, Ms. Araba Mensah. Our acting secretary and organizer, Mr. Eric Queno. And then we also have our finance, I call her finance minister, our financial controller in the person of Madam Millicent Doe. We also have our provincial coordinator in the person of Mr. Chafudeme. This is the third time we gave a mandate to the academic committee to host such a program. And so this program is being dedicated to the academic committee headed by Mr. Adimoyako John. We want to acknowledge all the leaders for the committee, the academic committee. We also want to acknowledge the presence of all other committees, the welfare committee, the organizing committee, the audit committee, and all other committees. And in fact, members of Nugs-Beijing, you are really awesome. You've been with us in every program that we do organize. We are also told that there are other brothers and sisters joining us from a different, not Nooks, but different union. We also want to acknowledge all of you. On this note, let me welcome all of you for coming, and let's enjoy together. We believe Professor Paul is going to coach us, and you would love it. Let's stay and enjoy. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. President, for your welcome address and introduction of chapter executive as well as our national executive. Members, I quickly invite Mr. John Tomoyako, who happens to be the chairman of the academic committee, to rightfully introduce our guest speaker. Mr. John, please, you have the floor. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much, Eric. It is a privilege to introduce my own lecturer. He taught me far back in 2004 at the bachelor's level. He has been inspiration to some of us as young students, and up today we still count on him. Professor Paul Kwame Nkegbe holds a PhD in agricultural and food economics from the University of Reading, UK. A degree he obtained in 2011. He is currently an associate professor of agriculture and applied economics at the Department of Economics and Entrepreneurship Development, University for Development Studies, Ghana. He has taught at the university level. He has taught at the university level for the past 14 years and has supervised over 19 doctoral and master's dissertations since 2013. He has consulted for several international and local organizations. His research interests are in applied microeconomic analysis, and his recent work is concentrated on rural livelihood with special focus on physical activity, adoption of productivity, enhancing innovation, and energy requirement connected with engagement in such activities. His papers appear in highly reputable journals. He is a member of several professional associations, including the Royal Economic Society. He has won several awards, grants, both locally and internationally. Ladies and gentlemen, it is a privilege to welcome Professor Kwame Paul Nkegbe. Thank you very much, sir. The floor is yours.
Thank you, John, for, I don't know how to describe that introduction. It would have just been enough for you to tell us that I taught you some years ago and I am still teaching. But thanks a lot for the opportunity to interact with you. I call this a conversation because I know you would have written one form of thesis or another even before this level. So this interaction, I refer to it as a conversation for us to see how we can write thesis better. So thank you for the opportunity, John. And then Eric, thanks so much for the opportunity to interact with you. So if If there aren't any other things, can we move straight to our business for today?
Hello,
Yes, please,
Eric.
Professor. Yes, please, Professor. You have the floor now. I think we have made you a co, so you can share your PPT,
Okay.
sir. Thank you,
Okay.
Prof.
Thank you. Thank you. Okay. Can we all see what is on the screen?
Yes, please, Professor. We can see your screen.
Right. So our today's conversation is on thesis writing, and I intend to share a number of things with you. In fact, when I got the topic thesis writing, I initially wanted us to narrow that down to something specific about the thesis. But later I left it as it is because I felt it's likely you want a very broad conversation on thesis writing. So because of that, I set out to think about what we should be discussing. So I have this outline for us to begin with what a thesis is. We will look at the models of a PhD and the task of authoring. We will also attempt to. Then I will mention a few common mistakes or threats to writing a successful PhD thesis. Then we'll also look at ways of choosing, the way to go, choosing a topic, and what makes a good thesis an original work. I will highlight some expectations of examiners, then some specific questions examiners will always ask when they are examining thesis. Then we will talk about getting started, the conception of getting started. We will also look at the structure of the thesis and the content. I do admit, and we'll mention that very soon, that for a lot of places, the structure might be slightly different, but we can talk about the general structure. Then we will also mention a few things, some caveats, things you should, and we will conclude. I do not know how we can set this. Is it Eric or John, if you can turn on your microphone and let's agree on this. Do you want me to finish with the presentation before we have questions, or as and when questions come, I can stop and respond to them?
I think, Prof, you can finish, then other questions will flow.
Okay, all right. Thank you. Thank you. To talk about what a thesis is, it's a detailed study and critical examination of a specific topic. The topic indeed must be very specific, especially it depends on your area of study. It must be original and creative piece of research, and which should have been independent process of work. It should provide new knowledge and useful information. Then it should also reflect work of publishable quality in scientific journals, or it should be enough for it to be shared, for the knowledge to be shared in international conferences. I know the issue of originality and being, it should be new knowledge, that usually gets students bogged down because it becomes a problem. How can I be very original, and how do I produce new knowledge? But as part of this conversation, we will look at some of that. Indeed, there are two basic models. If we're talking about models of, have two basic models of the PhD and writing the thesis. The classical one is like one I went through. It involves a monograph or a book thesis you write. It must be presented in like a conventional book, in the form of a conventional book, and usually between 80 to 100,000 words long. And then a very high level of authoring skills will be required to produce this, because these words must be deliberately linked, and the various sections must be deliberately linked. There must be a common thread running through all the sections of a monograph kind of thesis. The paper-based model. And what happens is that the paper-based model usually is kind of essays or a number of papers that are put together. Now, unlike the traditional kind of thesis where you must necessarily have a thread that is joining the various sections, for this kind of paper-based, you might not require a common thread joining them. But what happens is that there will normally be a kind of short introduction and a brief closing discussion, which serves to connect the various papers within the volume. And for that, you usually have something around 60,000 words or less. So these are the two basic model thesis, which currently is operational. Which one is the best, or which is better than the other? Maybe it will be part of our discussion for us all to agree. But it is difficult to tell this is better than the other. It depends on the circumstances and the requirements of the particular institution. In envisioning the thesis as a whole, you should attempt to answer a few questions. For example, what is your dissertation about? And of course, you would have also taken into account your specific disciplinary leaning. Then you ask the question, what is the dissertation about? You should be able to answer that. Now, and what contribution do you intend to make? And what do we intend to achieve? Apart from earning the PhD certificate, the thesis should have a name. Then what will be new or different about your work? A number of these questions you are unable to answer if you do not familiarize yourself with the literature in your area. But in some cases, you even have to go beyond your disciplinary leaning to see what others have done or are doing. Then you can place your work in perspective. Then how would you justify the time and resources that you will devote to the work? So these are some of the questions and useful ones you answer at the time of envisioning the thesis as a whole. And as I stated, in answering some of these questions, you are necessarily required to be conversant or to get conversant with the literature. Let me move on to some common mistakes we make or some threats to writing a successful PhD thesis. I made a point that usually the quest to be original and to produce new knowledge, each of this becomes very daunting for the students. The students, they must tackle much bigger or hard to research questions. because this is the way questions are framed in the literature they read. But you should note that there is a vast difference between a professional researcher who is based in universities and who have been doing this for so many years, and you, a student who we can call a researcher in training. So in bringing out the issue of originality or new knowledge, it must not necessarily be a mega thing. Don't think about it being so huge and outstanding that it must be visible to everyone. Sometimes it is a certain question been answered in the literature, or it is that the question has been answered, but the answer is inadequate. And that can give you an opportunity to contribute to the literature, to generate either a new way of doing it. And in fact, that will end up being very original. Again, PhD students also choose topics sometimes that are very dull and not important. In as much as you are thinking about originality, be careful that you might pick up something that is not very important in the literature, for which reason researchers have not pursued that. And you think because it hasn't been pursued, yes, that is the niche. It's a gap. Think about how important that gap is, and don't pursue such things. It is a bit difficult, but as you search the literature and share ideas with colleagues, talk to your supervisor or supervisors, some of these things will become very clear to you. Now, a closely related issue is just gap filling thesis designed solely to cover an uninhabited niche. Okay, that is what I have just discussed. And as I explained, gaps often exist for a good reason. For instance, because the topic has little intrinsic interest or value, or it is too difficult to take. In that sense, as a new researcher or a researcher in training, you might not want to spend all your time trying to resolve such difficult problems. Because remember, yes, you are a researcher in training, but you are working within very strict time limits. You do not have all the time on earth to carry out your work. Then also be careful about picking a defensive or an overcautious topic just to get finished, because this may have long-term problems. Do you want to finish in good time, yet you cannot publish a good article from your thesis? Think about that. A very dull or unfashionable for getting hired into your first academic or competitive job. Remember, one of the reasons we pursue PhD is to get hired into an academic job. But if you research a topic that is dull and of little significance, it might be difficult for you to have what we often refer to as your job market paper. And remember, these considerations can be magnified by some psychological effects of fixing on a boring or tiny subject just because you want to finish. Indeed, you can finish, but that could give you bigger problems later. What is the way to go in choosing a topic? Now, with the PhD work, you are required to define a question, and after defining, deliver the answer to the question. There is nothing like asking a huge question, then you underperform. If it is a huge question, the answer must be spot on. It must also be that huge to answer that huge question. So you should take a manageable part of the existing literature's questions or concerns, and then tailor that topic in a way that can be feasibly answered. So please, when asking questions, remember you must answer it and answer that adequately. Frame your thesis also around an intellectual problem or a paradox, and not just around a gap. It needs to focus on a set of phenomena that asks for explanation and which you can express as a non-obvious puzzle, and then effective answers. Now, I said the problem or paradox must be around, and the problem or paradox must be intellectual in nature. I share this thought that Robert Nozick, a very famous American philosopher, he said an intellectual problem has 5 basic components. First, it's a goal. It must have a goal or objective which can tell us how to judge outcomes, how to see that an improvement has been achieved. Once there's an objective or a goal, if we finish it, then we can tell whether that goal has been achieved or not. Second is an initial state, and that's the starting situation and the resources available to be used. There should be an initial state, and in this case, so that by the time you finish, you're able to tell the difference between what you have done and what the current situation is. There should, third, new data and a toolkit of research methods are required. So a set of operations that can be used to change the initial state and resources. The other component is constraints. And these constraints, they designate certain kinds of operations as inadmissible. So this is the fourth component of an intellectual problem. The fifth is indeed an outcome. Now, a problem has been solved or ameliorated somewhat if a sequence of admissible operations has been carried out, so that we are able to tell the difference between what we call the initial state and the end state, that is after carrying out that work. Another point to note is that you must think about the practicalities of research and your capabilities and resources right from the start. There is the need for you to guess in estimating the results and outcomes at the same time as you formulate a topic. So a few things you need to think about a best possible case. That is to say, what would you be able to say if everything went just as you hope that it will? But also think about the second best situation. What if the worst case happens? Things do not go the way you intended it. So you must have. Above all, you need to shape the thesis question to showcase your findings, to bring out the interest and importance, and to give a sense of completeness to the whole. Sometimes in our bid to be humble, we kind of, underestimate or underrate what we produce. But in doing thesis, you must, as much as possible, avoid that. There's the need to showcase your findings. There's the need to showcase what you are adding to the literature. You can do so without being arrogant. It is just the matter of being assertive. The thesis topic or question mostly has to be discovered a bit at a time and then worked up. Now, it is usually normal for you to have a certain question from your initial search of the literature. Then as you start working, moving on, you start improving, you see that there are improvements you can make to the question. That is acceptable, shaping the question as you move on. Then another thing you should consider is the thesis should be novel. It should be a novel piece of research, making some form of distinctive contribution to the development of knowledge in your discipline. A novel thesis should either report the discovery of new facts or display the exercise of independent critical work, or both. I explained this earlier. Being novel means you should be so original that it must be very big. It could be something little, yet that little thing is contributing a lot to the literature because some can stand on that to solve bigger problems. We want to look at what makes a good thesis and then an original work. Take note of your own words. In fact, your own. First, own words, ideas, and judgments, and you should be careful of plagiarism. Text and ideas, quotes, references, then attributions. Ensure that indeed it's normal in academia for you of others. You check the literature, see what has been done. You gain a lot from the literature. You gain a lot of inspiration, a lot of ideas from the literature, and don't be shy to acknowledge that. Because you use that to determine how much you can also contribute, and that helps you in doing so. Then new work in terms of questions, data, methods, interpretation, sometimes application of the methods, testing of knowledge, and how you bring out the interconnections of the various ideas you have gleaned from the literature. Again, a good thesis should clearly show and articulate the importance of the contribution that thesis is making. Please do not leave the contribution of your thesis to the reader or to the examiner. Bring that out clearly because it is a primary requirement in the PhD thesis. You should usually focus a good thesis should focus on the interesting and important information. By the time you are finishing, you know what is interesting, especially from the literature. You would have seen some questions in the literature that have not been answered. And by the time you are finishing, you are either answering them or contributing to answering some of those questions. Please showcase that. Bring that out. And you should pay attention to details. It doesn't matter how novel your piece of work is, how original it is. If it is not well written, if I say not well written, like you do the best to write it well, but if you have grammatical and spellings errors, I don't know who will want to spend time on such a piece of work. So you must pay attention to details to be able to spot grammatical and spelling errors and even syntax issues. You should pay attention to you should pay attention enough to have illustrated figures and graphs. Now, where you have such figures being derived or you're taking that from elsewhere, you should acknowledge that properly. Let me shift attention to expectations. There is no way this list can be exhaustive. I'm just mentioning some of the things. And to highlight, I mean, as an examiner myself, the things examiners, some of the things examiners look for. Examiners will look for adequate knowledge of the field, theory, in terms of literature or empirics. They will want to see whether the writer of the thesis has gained some knowledge. So they will want to measure the knowledge of the author within the person's field. And it doesn't matter, it could be theoretical or in terms of empirics. Again, examiners will want to see comprehensive, relevant, and up-to-date literature. Indeed, that is why, especially in a review of your literature, you should never be tempted to think that you have finished reviewing literature until you submit your work for examination. I remember the very week I was going to submit my thesis. One of the key things I had in the thesis as my contribution, that very week I was going to submit a thesis, I remember a paper landed in agricultural economics. And that paper was talking almost exactly about that. My world nearly came down crashing. But what happened was that I read this paper and I had to quickly look out for some of the other things I had done that the paper had not. So for literature, you should always be looking out for literature, up-to-date literature. Fortunately, for a number of good universities, they have subscribed to a lot of, topical and impactful journals. So just set up the alerts, and you should, on daily basis, you should know what is coming in your area. Another is clear and logical presentation of key results. Examiners will want to see how logical you present your results and how logical your argument, your discussion of the results are. Then another is effective arguments and conclusions. Of course, that is what I just mentioned. It also has to do with how logical that is. Then a piece that is well written, a piece that is accurate, a piece that does everything possible to reduce ambiguity or eliminates that's everything possible to eliminate ambiguity. We have already mentioned that you should be attentive to details. Some typos are unpardonable, and you should do due diligence to spot them. Examiners want to see how coherent your argument is. Is the storyline strong? Is it rational? How convincing is the storyline? Examiners might also want to look out for, in fact, will look out for how honest you are. Do you properly contributions of others? What implications do you draw from your study? And are these implications, do they follow logically from your results? Are you also honest enough to admit that, notwithstanding that your work should be seen as an excellent one, there are some limitations or there are some shortcomings? But what you should not do is to crucify yourself in attempting to bring out the limitations of your work. Be honest about it, about the limitations, but you also need to explain why, despite the limitations, we should still place some value on your work. Above all, examiners will be they can learn from. The truth is, as a researcher in training, your supervisors are helping you, they are training you, but they are also learning a lot from you. In the same vein, examiners, when they pick any piece of work, they learn from it, and they get excited when they learn a lot from a work they examine. In looking out for these things, examiners ask some specific questions, some of which are the research aims or objectives clear? Has this candidate reviewed literature? Now, there's a difference between reviewing literature and just compiling literature. In reviewing literature, you will want to assess and critique where necessary. Again, examiners will want to see, they ask the question, there are some key papers in this area. Is this candidate aware? And for that matter, has the candidate included that or some of the key papers? Another thing that is of interest is the soundness of the theoretical basis. Examiners will ask questions and they will want to see answers. That answer. Are conjectures consistent with theory? How appropriate is the methodology? And then whether evidence or facts have been collected. Are these facts sufficient to answer the questions the candidate set out to answer? What about validity and reliability of the facts? And then are the findings assessed against literature? One of the reasons in writing thesis, one of the reasons you review literature is that you make use of that when you get to your discussion. You draw parallels. In your discussion, you attempt to draw parallels with what is in the literature. So where what you are finding agrees with the literature, you say so. Where there are disagreements with some, you mention that and explain why what you are finding is still valid. Another question is, do the findings make significant contribution to the field? Are there any inconsistencies? Are the conclusions and takeaways from the thesis, are they adequate? And then a very typical question is, the examiners will want answered is, they will want to find out whether the student actually carried out the work. I want us to go to now look at conception or getting started, getting the thesis started. So how do you conceptualize the question or think about the question you want? Take note to work on topics you are interested in or studied and what you would like to know more about. Pick a topic that interests you. And yet, in fact, in most cases, it's the interest that will push you beyond your limits. Also, think about theories you are interested in and what you would like to know more about in those theories. Also, think about topical or contemporary issues and what you would like to know more about those issues. Now, is there a question you feel the body of knowledge in your field does not answer adequately? Also read, in fact, is you should read the graduate school's guidelines for writing thesis. Because even though we have general guidelines, each graduate school might have some specific things different from the general one. So you must get used to that, because at the end of the day, your work is assessed on the basis of the particular graduate school's guidelines. Once you go through this and you have a question in mind, you look for relevant information to the topic by reading as much as you can, academic research, literature from other areas, not necessarily academic, and then information in the popular press. Sometimes you glean such things, then you take them into the academic literature. Look for information on theoretical framework. Read examples of theses from your department. Once you are well informed about the topic and prior research and requirements, then that should suggest a purpose for your thesis. The next thing you do is to write the proposal or the concept art. And that should be very clear. Another thing I want us to look at in conceiving the thesis is the concept or proposal specifics. What should we have in the proposal? Of course, these are basic things: purpose of the study, questions and or objectives, and remember that should be derived from literature or your explanation of the problem. Then significance of the study. You would also have tentative literature review on the topic. Just remember that your literature review is always tentative until you conclude the work. Then theoretical framework. So you have a working bibliography, which you should attach. Research hypothesis, then proposed methodology. This proposed methodology will answer how you will collect and analyze your data. And in explaining how you analyze and collect the data, instrumentation issues also will come in. Now, depending on the school regulations, you discuss the proposal as part of your qualifying exam, then obtain clearance of your interview protocol, especially from your institutional review board. So the next step is collecting and analyzing the data, and then writing up the findings, and then the final chapter. Make sure the chapters of the proposal are now fully developed at this point. Expect to work as an independent researcher, as independent as possible. Even though your supervisors are available, they are there to guide you at each point you require guidance. They are not there to write the thesis for you. What about the thesis, the structure of the thesis and the content? As I mentioned, based on the two models, some come as papers or paper-based thesis, others are the traditional monograph. So what I'm setting at this point is like the traditional monograph. You have a title page, you have declarations, table of contents, list of tables, list of figures, acronyms, etc. These, the guidelines of your specific graduate school will spell them out. And you will have an introduction. The introduction will usually answer some of the whys based on review of literature or theory, some gaps, and then you give some context to that. within that, you have the background, the research problem, the need for the research. In discussing the need, you discuss applied and scientific contributions and who it will benefit. You also discuss context issues to further clarify the problem. You have objectives, and these should be clearly stated. You provide clearly defined purpose and strong theoretical grounding, and the thesis is fundamentally flawed from the outset without these. Within the introduction to you should answer the issue of significance of the study. How original is it? What is its contribution? Is the contribution theoretical or empirical? And then the practical significance for professionals in the field or policy, that is its applied significance. Then there should be a brief literature review. The study purpose should suggest a theoretical framework to be explained. And as I stated earlier, the literature review should not merely string together what other researchers have found. The review should indeed be a review. It should be detailed analysis, assessment, and critique of the literature. So the review can be structured as like overview, where you give some theoretical foundations, then review of issues. In doing so, you could group articles on the basis of issues or ideas. You may want to look at common trends before you bring about divergence or departures from each idea. Your review could also concentrate on models, what models you might use, then some hypotheses and propositions. Remember, your hypotheses or propositions should usually be grounded in the literature. Scope issues also come in, the scope of the study. You discuss any theoretical assumptions and limitations they impose. The methods, what and how. And you should do this in sufficient details. The methods chapter describes and justifies the data gathering and analysis and analytical tools you would be using or you have used. So you begin by describing the method you chose and why you chose that as against others. In doing so, you should cite references within the literature to support that. You should detail every step of the data gathering and analysis process. Now, that section varies depending on the method and analysis technique chosen. And many of the following areas typically are addressed. So these are typical areas. You have introduction, description of research design. Then you will describe the population and sampling issues. Then you will discuss development of instrument or method for collecting, making observations. You will also usually describe the administration of the instruments. The administration of the instrument, how you administered that. You talk about observation, content analysis, especially for qualitative work. You should describe your data analysis in detail. For quantitative analysis or research, for example, you want to look at the statistical or econometric analysis and test performed. You want to discuss choice and justification of the models you're using. You want to discuss the model and estimation process. And if possible, the econometric software you are employing. For qualitative research, you will want to discuss identification of themes or categories, then discuss the approaches. For instance, the media analytics, mixed methods research, qualitative comparative analysis, whether there's quantitative content analysis, then sentiment analysis and text analytics. softwares you can use for this. That also depends on your department, the school, and even the disciplinary leaning of your supervisor. You could be advised, but there are a lot of qualitative research, qualitative analytical softwares to choose from. Then your results. In presenting your results, you want to look at what you want to explain what you found. So in doing so, there should be careful selection of figures and tables. Your particular discipline has a certain style of doing so. Adopt that. Now, in a number of places, results and discussion are to know what is required in your area. So where we talk about results, that chapter should include, in fact, it should not discuss the results. The chapter does not include discussing other research literature or the implications of your findings. It presents the findings as they are. And how do we do that? Outline any descriptive or exploratory or confirmatory analysis on central variables. It will address the results of the test of objectives or questions or hypotheses. It will discuss any exposed factor analysis, for instance, model extension, sensitivity analysis, and or robustness checks. Then for qualitative research, this will be organized by the themes or categories uncovered in your research. So for focus groups or interviews, it is often appropriate to provide a brief descriptive profile of the participants first, then some direct quotation and paraphrasing and explaining, and yes, some direct quotations and paraphrasing. And in some cases, the analysis also includes information from field notes or other interpretative data. Then comes discussion. It's in the discussion you draw the parallels. Note, do not reiterate your findings here or present your opinion. You are expected to discuss what the findings you have provided, what they mean in relation to, for example, your theoretical framework, the theoretical framework you introduced, the theoretical body of knowledge on the topic, the empirical literature in the area, the study's practical implication. These practical implications, they are things of the area. And in some cases, the trends observed in the descriptive statistics or preliminary analysis. There's a caution here that students sometimes hold back on this chapter, even though it may be the most important one because it answers the so what question. Take note, the discussion part is where to showcase the work properly. Because at this point, you're bringing out the implications of the results and also drawing parallels with what is in the literature. Some findings will be similar to what is in the literature. Others will diverge from what is in the literature. And this is the point to explain why the divergence and why that is still valid. And also showcasing your contribution in that regard. And in the discussion, remember to also outline the limitations of the study and then weave that into proposed areas for future research. Because the truth is, you pick a study, there is no way you can resolve all the issues on that topic. You do as much as possible. Some of the things you cannot do. So be honest enough to state that as the limitation of your work. And also prepare the ground to set that up as proposed areas for future research. But these must not be obvious. I remember sitting in an exam when a candidate should have answered a particular question. The candidate, I don't know whether due to time or deliberately did not answer when a question was put to the candidate regarding that, and the answer was my proposed areas for future research. But we went back into the data, and the data required to answer that question was sitting right in the work. So such a candidate had to go back to answer that. So let's be careful what we couch as proposed areas for future research. Once we have the data, let's do the work. Then the final chapter is usually the summary, conclusions, and recommendations or suggestions. So the summary of the entire thesis, then conclusions and implications, usually with reference to the literature and speculation about general possible consequences, both theoretically and practically. And this one may include writer's opinion, and remember these opinions will be based on the results. Then policy implications. So we then have the limitations in terms of theory, scope, and method, and some suggestions for future research. Now we go on to things to avoid. A bad thesis will badly describe the problem it is setting out to resolve. So avoid that. A bad thesis will present material that is not interesting, or too much material badly summarized or organized. A bad thesis will poorly present as being collected. And sometimes a painstaking process would have been adopted to collect the information, but when that is poorly presented, it gives the impression of a bad thesis, so avoid that. And as I cautioned at the beginning, do not leave the contribution of your work to your reader. You should be able to spot and mention that in very explicit terms. So avoid, for a bad thesis, there will be difficulty to extract take-home messages. Then avoid lack of objectivity. As much as there is lack of objectivity in a bad thesis, you have your own subjective views. But in writing a thesis, forget about your subjective views and be as objective as possible. Avoid insufficient explanation of results. Especially in the discussion of your results, discuss that as much as possible. Compare that with what is in the literature as much as possible. Avoid repeating or simply confirming well-established facts. Avoid that in your thesis. That shouldn't be the crux of your thesis. Yes, you can have results that are similar to what is in the literature. That is acceptable, but the crux of your thesis should not just be repeating or confirming well-established facts. Possible, the presentation of graphs and illustrations should be done in a very coherent manner. It shouldn't be poorly done. Avoid conclusions that are not derived from your results. So your conclusions should be aligned with the results. I have already cautioned about too many grammatical and typos and lots of repetitions. Please avoid that. In as much as you need to showcase the contribution of your study, avoid arrogance and failing to acknowledge the contribution of others. I have been talking for a very long time, so let me move on to our conclusion. The doctoral thesis is a contract, or doctoral studies is a contract of a rather peculiar kind. The author develops and communicates a question and then professes an answer to it. The examiners will determine if the research text produced actually answers the questions posed. And if there is a close fit between the question and the answer, then the thesis passes successfully. But if that is not the case, you know what the implication is. But students must not offer a mushy set of materials undirected to a clear question. Students must not promise what they cannot deliver or claim to achieve what they have not. When we started, I told you that unlike other kinds of studies, the PhD thesis is about posing the question and delivering on the answer. So the PhD, the student must show that the question is a serious one and indeed a legitimate one to warrant an academic inquiry. A useful device to bear in mind here is the value added concept. The value added concept. That will usually help to bring out the contribution of the study. Always look out for the value you have added. In doing so, you bring out your contribution to the literature. Thank you for being very attentive right from the beginning to this point. So I said it's going to be a conversation. I have done the talking. Let me listen to you so that we can share further ideas. Thank you for listening. Yeah.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Professor Kwame Nkegbe, for your insightful presentation. I believe that we have all enjoyed your presentation and we have a lot of questions for you. Members, can you kindly permit me to use some few minutes to acknowledge some presence of other national and chapter executive? I think the national president has already been duly acknowledged. We also have in our mix the national secretary, Miss Francisca Bo. We also have national past president, Mr. Benjamin K. Bafo, Shanghai chapter organizer Atukamna, Tianjin secretary Ajua, Nanjing organizer Clement, Chonjo secretary Jifa, Hanjo vice president Gideon, Hujo vice president Sergio, Shanghai president Mr. Thompson, and our very own Dr. Isabella. Ladies and gentlemen, you are warmly welcome to our program. Without wasting my time, the floor is open for questions. Please, I humbly want to suggest that if you have a question, kindly use the raise hand button so that we can really see you and so that you can ask your question. So the floor is open now. Thank you.
Can I stop the screen share now?
Okay. Yes.
No, when it is necessary, I'll do so. Okay.
Okay, Prof.
Yeah.
Madalena, please, you can go ahead with your question. Thank you. Madam Lina.
Hello. Hello.
Yeah,
please, can you hear me?
Yes, please, we can hear you.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, Prof, for this insightful education. I've really learned a lot. But please, what I would like to find out is what is supposed to go into background and what is supposed to go into what introduction? Because I did my background and my supervisor told me that I have added too many references and that the background shouldn't have many references. So she asked me to delete some of the references from it. So please, can you briefly tell us what's supposed to go into background and what's supposed to go into introduction. Thank you.
Thank you.
Eric.
Yes, Prof. Sorry.
Can we take like 4 or 5 questions at a time? Prof will note them so that we address them as we go along.
Sure.
Yes.
Oh no, I think maybe we can make it 2 to 3. Maybe
Okay,
4.
three.
Yeah, 2. Okay. Yeah,
Okay.
sure. Thank you. Other members, please. The floor is still open for questions. Yeah. Mr. Gideon, please, you can go ahead. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Honorable Eric. Yes, my question is on the literature review. Can Prof distinguish between theoretical review, empirical review, or conceptual review? These ones, because some supervisors actually want you to specify which review. So theoretical, empirical, or conceptual review. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Gideon. Please, the last question for this round. Okay, then let me take this opportunity to ask my question. Prof, please, my question is on the gap. Normally we do here, we should have maybe the content gap or the geographical gap. But I want to ask that these two, which of this is very much appropriate? I know some authors do say that it's better to have the content gap rather than the geographical gap. So I want to also hear from your side which of this is very much appropriate. Thank you, Prof.
Okay, right. Thank you. So let me start with Madam Lina's question. Did I hear introduction and background?
Yes, please, Prof. Her question was on
that's
introduction
the
and
question.
background.
Yes. Okay. Typically, if you are doing a monograph, the background is part of the introduction. If you are doing a monograph, the background comes as a section within the introduction. But if it is a paper, the introduction indeed sets the stage for the paper. The background then gives, it's like background to the problem. Now, within that background, it is appropriate for you to have some minimal level of literature so that you can give some insight to the problem within the background. But also depending on a journal, that if it's a paper, depending on the journal, some require that as part of the introduction, you should review literature extensively so that you do not have a separate section on literature review. So for these things, you will want to look at the specific requirements. But otherwise, the introduction sets out the general guide to the paper, then the background will give some insight into the problem. And indeed, you will want to keep the literature to the minimum. As much as possible, you want to keep the literature there to the minimum. But I do acknowledge there are times you cannot tell between the introduction and the background. In fact, depending on requirements of a journal, everything is put together. You are expected to do everything together. But where there is a requirement for you to separate that, just note that the introduction gives general information about the study, then the background will give specific background coming from literature, but you won't want to turn it into another literature review section. Okay. Right. Gideon asks about theoretical review, conceptual review, and empirical review. As they suggest, where you review the literature, an emphasis is on theoretical approaches, the theories, then that comes under theoretical review. But usually in your study, you are required to review both theoretical and empirical literature. Empirics is simply where emphasis is on applied studies and the results from such studies. That's the empiric. So, like you have gathered on some themes, and you start the synthesis and analysis of the paper on the basis of the results they have produced. That's the empirical. Theoretical actually concentrates on issues of theory and development. Yes, you also added conceptual. Usually the theoretical review will lead you to building a kind of conceptual frame for your work. So the division line in fact between the theoretical review and the conceptual review might be very thin, but empirical review stands out because emphasis is on the empirics or the results. Eric, you answered the question, or you attempted answering it yourself, because you asked about the gap, research gap. We have, what's the name, geographical gap, and then content, which is more important. I learned this during my PhD work, that especially with the PhD work, geographical gap is usually not enough, because when you want to publish the paper out there, what is required is the larger picture. So it's not enough for you to say that, yes, this study was carried out in this country, but in this other place, it hasn't been done. And that is the novelty of what you are doing. But the PhD, in actual sense, emphasis should be on the content, what gap is in the content, and not just the geographical. There are exceptions though. The exception is this: if we have very strong reasons to believe that even though there is a certain study that has been carried out elsewhere, but geography plays an important role, and that also is a significant piece in that geography you want to look at, you can defend it, because it is not just the geographical importance, but there is also so much applied or empirical value in it. But as much as possible, at the PhD level, emphasis should be on content gap rather than. Okay, thank you.
Thank you very much, Prof. The next round of questions, Mr. Zacchaeus, please, your hand is up. You have the floor.
All right. Thank you for the opportunity. First of all, I would like to appreciate Prof for such a great presentation. I really enjoyed it. My question is, please, what easy steps or ways can one employ to come out with a very good hypothesis regarding one's thesis or a paper? Sometimes it becomes difficult for researchers to be able to come out with a very good hypothesis regarding the kind of work that we are doing. And this is what I would like you to throw more light on. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Zacchaeus. Mr. Ejumaze, please, your hand is up. You have the floor.
Okay, thank you very much. Professor, I want to ask, in the course of your review, when there are few material to review the paper, or sometimes the thesis you want to review, there is no material to gather to review that paper, what do you do?
Okay.
Thank you very much, Mr. Ejumaze. Please, any other question for this round? Members, please, I will plead that, as Prof rightly said, there is a discussion section. So please, I want to believe that we are all in the stage of thesis writing, both master's and PhD level. So please, let's take this opportunity to ask questions so that we may clear any doubt that we have. Prof, I also take this opportunity to ask my second question.
Okay.
Prof, you spoke about validity and reliability, and one thing I've realized is that, especially when we are conducting our studies or thesis with the quantitative approach, where in some cases we are using teachers as our respondent. But we realize that, for example, if maybe you are targeting about 250 respondents, and you realize to have about 150 respondents, and you also want 250. At a certain stage, you are being tempted to even duplicate some of the responses to have your 250. Of which I believe that some of us do go through this. Sometimes you want to duplicate the responses to get to 250, and I don't know whether probably it's because teachers are not, sometimes they feel reluctant to answer a questionnaire for us. In that case, what do you do or how do you go about this, Prof? Thank you very much, Prof.
Okay. Thank you. Okay, please, it shouldn't just be questions. Some might have, what's the name? Some suggestions they want to share so that others can also benefit from that. But to answer these questions, the process of coming out with testable hypothesis, the starting point is the literature. See this, I remember not too long ago, I examined a thesis. It was an impact evaluation study. So this candidate dropped some hypotheses. But the truth of the matter is that those hypotheses honestly came from nowhere. You couldn't see that coming from the literature, coming from the prior discussion of the issues. So I asked the question, oh, you have this number of hypotheses and they appear reasonable. They can help you answer the question that yes, where are they coming from? And the response I got was, oh, I simply turned the questions into hypothesis. But then where did you get the questions from? Usually trace this to the literature. Now, the suggestion I gave the person was, I also asked a question, what is a theory of change? Now, this person was evaluating a particular project. That project should have a theory of change. Unfortunately, throughout that thesis, over 200 pages of thesis, you would not see anything on theory of change. But you see, before a program or project is launched, there is a theory of change, and that is what moves the project. The project tends to move towards achieving that. So if this candidate had reviewed the program or project theory of change, in actual sense, those hypotheses would have simply come in the theory of change. So a good way of getting testable hypothesis is to search the literature. By the time you set out your problem correctly, you will have to answer some questions, and these questions will be derived from the literature. So the hypothesis will be derived from that. One of our friends asked a question about review. When you are reviewing literature and you really don't have anything to review, it is both a challenge and an opportunity. But what you will be advised to do is broaden your search. Maybe your search is rather very narrow, and that is why you are not getting any material. To take on similar things, not necessarily the same, but things that are close. That way, you can place your work in perspective. But I do agree that genuinely, you might pick up something that is very difficult for you to come by literature on that, even though it's rare. But where that happens, I know that is why supervisors are there to guide you. They can suggest some close areas that you can look at to help you get some literature to use for the purpose of your work. I agree, it's usually difficult, but mostly not finding any material comes from the way we search, and not that we can really not find any material. Validity and reliability, my good friend Eric. The question borders on ethics of research. And when you are under training, we also train you to be ethical. The truth is that when you are working out your sample, once you settle on acceptable sample, it is advisable for you, usually something up to between 5 to 20%, for you to oversample. So that if you require 250, you do not send out exactly 250 questionnaires. You should usually send out more, so that if you have issues of non-response, then hopefully you will end up landing either on your sample or something very close to your sample. Remember, by the time you work out the acceptable sample, you are saying that that is what will give you a representative sample from your population. So if you take the sample, you collect your data, and it falls short of the sample, the gap is large, that will raise very, very serious issues. So always work out your sample, overshoot the sample, and hopefully your response rate might not exceed 10%. So if that happens, you are still well above your sample. Note that oversampling isn't a problem, but undersampling is a serious problem. But avoid the temptation to be unethical by simply duplicating your responses to hit your sample size. It can be tempting, but with planning, you can avoid that. With good planning, you can avoid that. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor.
Can I,
Indeed, it can be tempting, but with planning, you can avoid that. Yeah, please,
can I come
someone
in?
wanted to ask something. Sure, Mr. Demiako, you can come in.
Yes, I just want to add something that Prof have just addressed. The issue with sampling.
Yes.
There is always a justification
Sure.
for either for a gap, a falling gap in sampling.
Sure.
For instance, when you take Criswell 2013, he will indicate to you that if you take any data or you project any data and you are able to get 50% of that data, it's enough justification for you to start your analysis. So assuming that you targeted 200 and 100 people have responded to your questions, there's no need for you to duplicate your work. There is literature that can support the reasons for you using the 50% for your analysis. The most important thing is that you have to justify why you are using that. So it is very, very important that we read the qualitative aspect of what methodology to understand some of these things. So it's very important. So any data collected, which is 50% and above, it is acceptable for what? Any form of analysis. You can go ahead from there. The next one has to do with the issue with literature, the lack of literature. I think basically it is all about how you begin your whole thesis. For instance, ideally, the ideal way of beginning a thesis is when you propose a title or the title to your thesis. What a supervisor normally do is that you go and search for bibliography. So before you come back, you are able to report whether there will be enough literature for your work or not. So you don't wait to the middle of it and then the challenges will start coming and alongside. Prof also indicated that we need to improve our way of searching for literature. Searching for literature is something that is an act that one must learn. Sometimes you go to the net as if it is not there, but how to search it is always the issue. I think the last one has to do with a question I want to ask Prof.
Okay.
Yes, at what point in time do you need a hypothesis? And at what point in time can you also use a research questions or both during your thesis? So that is my question. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Domiako. Please, before I call Madam Lina and Mr. Emmanuel, please let's also give opportunity to Mr. Benjamin Kebafo, who wants to add something a little to the sampling. Sir, please, you have the floor.
Thank you very much. Please, can you hear me?
Yes, please, we can hear you.
Okay, first of all, I want to say thank you so much, Professor. I've really learned a lot. I'm sorry I'm in a train, that's why, but and thank you so much to the organizers and NEC as well. With the sample size, as Professor said, I think that the person who has the problem, let's say, is supposed to get a sample size after doing the necessary calculations. Sometimes it depends on the person. If the person is using this probability sampling or non-probability sampling, so the person has to be taking note of that, right? If it's a probability sampling and the person is using, one thing I've also noticed is that the person, in a way, can also calculate the effect size using the can increase the effect size. Sure. Using J power to increase the effect size. That can also lower you getting the required sample size for your work. Additionally, the person also can in a way indicate that maybe it's not the probability sampling by purposive sampling. In that way, you can give the readers an idea that your work, yes, you are supposed to get this kind of sample size, but because you are doing it for a purpose, which you supported with literature, that is why you use this kind of sampling. And like I said from the beginning, if you increase the effect size, which sometimes when you increase it, it's going to give you the sample size you need, all right, but it's not going to be a strong one to buttress your case. Nonetheless, you can indicate that even though your effect size is not really strong, that can be a plausible research. That can be, how do you call it? worked upon. So that can be your limitation. So that is what I wanted to add to what Professor said. Thank you.
Right. Thank you.
Eric.
Yes, Prof. Yes, thank you. And I mean, interesting contributions. Just to caution or explain the sample size, to add to the sample size explanation. You see, if we are doing a purely quantitative study, purely quantitative, you employ the sample size calculation, and our good friend just added the effect size, and you require that. By the time you come up with your sample size, what you're really saying is that this is the minimum size I require to be able to draw sample from the population. So that is why if you read, the advice always is for you. The advice always is for you to. The advice always is for you to overshoot your what's the name, sample, so that if you have non-response issues, you can justify that. But if you do not, I'm afraid, for purely quantitative study, those of you who are studying economics and you set out to collect data from the field, if you work out your acceptable sample and you end up using half of that sample, you will run into serious problems with examiners. I'm just cautioning. If it's a mixed study, if it's a qualitative study, that one, for qualitative study, they say you cannot really even determine your sample. What you use to determine the sample is if you reach a saturation point, you can stop. Saturation point is when you start getting very similar responses or same, that it won't add any value to your work. So please be careful about the sample size issue. Okay. Then that was John who asked about, the same John asked about hypothesis. Is that not it?
Yes, please, Prof.
Yes, he asked about hypothesis.
And research questions.
And research, okay, hypothesis and research questions. Did you ask? You must always have your research questions. Always, you must have your research questions. It comes in when you want to strengthen a certain position. In actual sense, I remember when I was doing my master's, the advice was this: use hypothesis only when you are doing a quantitative modeling. And for qualitative, you better call it a priori expectation. Now, hypothesis can be derived from your objectives or the model you are setting up. So for a lot of studies, you might find that once you are modeling, there might not be the need for you to set out your hypothesis. After all, you derive your questions from your objectives from the research questions. So yes, sometimes the only thing they reinforce one another. But I haven't seen that, or I am not sure, I don't think your work will be dealt a deadly blow if you start from the beginning to the end without a hypothesis. Sometimes you are not stating, in fact, most of the time you are not stating the hypothesis clearly, but for each model in your work we pick, there are underlying hypotheses that you are testing. I don't know whether I'm answering your question, John.
Yes, sir.
Okay. Yeah.
Thank you very much,
Eric,
Prof.
Eric,
Yes, Prof.
you can take over. Yes.
All right. Thank you very much, Prof. Madam Lina, please, your hand is up. Please, you have the floor. After which we also give opportunity to Mr. Emmanuel to ask his question. Madalina.
Okay, thank you very much. Please, this is a follow-up question on Mr. Edumazo's question.
Okay.
Talking about having not having enough literature to review. Actually, I'm having a similar problem now as I'm speaking to find some literature. And it ranges from 2008 and 2014. And then my supervisor is complaining that it's too old.
Okay.
So yes, I should look for literature that is very current. And honestly, it's very difficult to get the literature. So in this case, is there a way to justify it? Or most of the literature I'm finding, I'm doing cold storage facility management, but most of the literature I'm finding is on pharmaceutical. Yeah, even though she's claiming it's old, most of them, and is pharmaceutical is about food chain. So it's closely related to what I'm doing. But the woman is saying that it's too old. So right now I really don't know what to do. Is there any advice you can offer? Thank you very much.
Okay.
Thank you.
Eric.
Mr. Emmanuel, please, your question. Yes, Prof.
Oh, okay. I thought you would want us to talk about that. It's all right. You invite Emmanuel.
All right. Thank you, Prof.
Thank
Mr.
you
Emmanuel.
very much, Prof. Thank you also to the organizers. My question has to do with the choosing a topic, but I think that has been greatly dealt with. But I wanted to make some clarification, or maybe should I say it's a form of a question. I'm coming from a different background, and I realized throughout the conversations it has been like, but I'm coming from sciences. I'm into analytical chemistry. I might say I'm talking from Canada. Yes.
Okay.
So when you are confronted with, for instance, you have something in mind, but you also your supervisor or something, even before you come in here, he has proud thought of something to give to you already. How do you reconcile that? And my second question actually goes to the organizers. Please, is it possible if we can get the recording of this program, or maybe the slides for our future references? Thank you so much.
Sure, it will be made available. It will be available for whoever wants it. So after the program. But I don't know if you are on WeChat or WhatsApp, maybe afterwards you can contact any of us and then we can give it to you.
Okay, I'll leave my email in the chat feature. Thank you.
All right.
Okay. So the second one has been answered. Eric.
Yes, please, Prof. So, Prof, please, you can go ahead with the two questions. I don't know if maybe I can add mine to make it 3.
Or Eric, add yours.
Thank you very much, Prof. Prof, yes, mine is with reference to literature reviewing. I believe you've already dealt with it, and I want to believe that ideally, before we even set out to write our thesis, it will be very much appropriate to even look at the available literatures so as to get our questions, or to set our questions to the particular issue that we want to address, so that at least it will aid us with respect to literature review, particularly the empirical aspects. Because in your latter part, where in the chapter 4 or the result and discussion, where we will have to back our findings with literature, particularly the empirical side. So I'm tempted to believe that even before we set out to write our thesis, it will be very much appropriate to review literature to even get questions or research questions that have been previously answered, so that at least we also used to form our research questions. Thank you, Prof.
Okay, thanks. Then it's not a question. I mean, you are contributing. Is that not? It's a contribution. Is that not? But
okay,
but
Prof.
That in actual sense is the case when you are coming up with a topic. I advise, or the advice usually is, even in conceptualizing the topic, please start from the literature. Study the literature. You will find some gaps. You ask yourself, how do I fill these important gaps? But our friend from Canada asked a question. He's into the sciences. The topic is not his. I believe the supervisor is in the lab and he's conducting some work. So the supervisor, your supervisor, puts you on that. The topic is not originally yours. So you are supposed to work on that. Again, it doesn't matter. Search the literature. Now, one good thing about the sciences, there is no literature on it. You can easily show and prove that. And your supervisor, remember your supervisor will be working closely with you. What matters is the approach you have used, and then whether you have actually documented that properly. So in the sciences, yes, you can have that rare case of not finding the literature you want. Especially, it becomes very difficult when it is funding. You are joining your supervisor in his lab and you are doing some work. But again, like our sister Lina asked, what you can do is to look for things that are similar. Madam, it's not so much of a problem. You can find some literature, but your supervisor thinks the literature is rather dated. And she is right. What you need to do is to convince her that yes, even though this is dated, that is the earliest, the latest we have. And I know she will also be interested in verifying this. So once you manage to convince her, I mean, you can move on, you can justify that. Okay. Have I answered both questions? Because one was about conception of topic. Our colleague from Canada, I've spoken about it. And then Lina's own was about the literature being dated. For Eric, yours, it was a contribution. So thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor. Honorable members, please, last round of questions. Okay, Madalena, your hands is up again. You have the floor.
Yes, please. I'm really on my work, so I everything before Prof leaves. For my work.
Don't worry.
Yes, I was basing my work on Porter's hypothesis, which said that greater regulatory stringency leads to greater profitability. So I'm looking into the impact of compliance on the firm's profit. And the problem I'm having now is, am I supposed to develop a hypothesis, or I can just go with the research questions? I think there's my last question.
Thank you very much. In fact, Prof will address you soon. Sorry, Prof. Mr. Opon, please, you have the floor.
Okay, thank you very much. Thank you, Prof, for the lecture and the tutoring at the same time. I want to ask a question from maybe the economics perspective. Looking at our country, for instance, whereby data is a bit like I wouldn't say a bit, but a problem. Mostly if you want to do things which are like empirical, and also if you want to do things with secondary data, is it advisable for us to use primary data at the PhD level for economic related studies? And also, I want to know, like, despite the fact that we are supposed to write articles and maybe make publications, do you think it is ethical to come up with research which greatly impacts our society, or we just have to just write the papers for writing's sake and just make the like theoretical kind of contribution and that's all? Or you think there is a burden on us to write research which will impact our society and aid in our development and growth as Ghana, or maybe as like an African continent as we are coming from? And my last question is on like theories and models. Now, from the economic perspective, I remember like doing my master's thesis, my supervisor will only just say like, okay, you have this model, it is good. You have this model, it is good. But have you thought of bringing in another model or like a robust testing? That's all that she kept saying. Do you think it's advisable for us to use different models to test the same thing in a paper? So like in one paper, you have like a model, and then after analyzing with that model, you use another model to test it and another model to test it. And in doing that, I realized that sometimes maybe a model might be significant and another model might not be significant. In such case, should we just go ahead with the one which is significant and stop even commenting on the one which is not significant so that our people can pass? Okay, thank you so much.
Thank you, Mr. Pong. Mr. Chris, your hand was up, Mr. Chris.
Okay, thank you very much, Prof. Thank you, Prof, and good evening. Prof, I have some 3 questions to ask. One has to do with the literature review. In reviewing literature, is it always okay to relate your review, revolve the review around the research questions? The second question has to do with the setting of hypotheses. Sometimes I see that people set their hypothesis based on the research tips or the questions into hypothesis. I don't know if that is correct. And finally, when you are writing your research paper, your final dissertation, it takes a bit of time. Assuming I'm working on a topic and I get to the tail end of the topic, maybe I'm at the point of discussion, then I realize that maybe parts of my paper has been published or my work has been published. What do I do? With such a situation? Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Chris. Mr. Abudu, please. Humbly plead so that Prof will answer this question. Then the next round, you come with your question, Mr. Abudu. Thank you. Prof, please,
that's what I wanted to say. We have so many questions. So Lina, your topic itself is a hypothesis. So why do you want to run away from the hypothesis? Hello, Lina.
Hello, sir.
From what you said, you're actually even trying to check a certain hypothesis. Is that not it?
Yes.
Yeah, so why do you want to run away from hypothesis?
Because my supervisor never mentioned that, so I was thinking if it's advisable for me to do that.
Yes, in actual sense, you may not even have to explicitly state it's going to be that you set out to test this and you have found A, B, C, D. After all, what you are even setting out to do is actually a hypothesis you are trying to test. So it doesn't matter if your supervisor doesn't talk about hypothesis, but by the time you finish, you will know that you have actually tested a hypothesis. Right. Now, someone asks primary data at the PhD level for study. In our country, is it advisable to collect your own data? To the extent that you have funding, please, you can collect your own data. and depending on how specific the study is. Some studies are such that you can secondary data that you can use to answer the questions you want to answer. So in those cases, please collect your own data. But don't shy away from using secondary data at all, even at the PhD level. Don't worry. I mean, given the data we have, note that your study can only be as accurate as the data set. The data we have, though it might not be very accurate, but under the circumstances, that is the best we can lay our hands on. In fact, we have the GLSS data sets. We have up to the 7th wave. I will encourage people, those doing economics related studies, use that data set. There's a lot we can learn from the Living Standard Survey data set. In data, use it. And we have a lot of other sources of secondary data. Yes, people usually will have reasons to believe that some aspects of those data are not correct. You can do some basic tests. And if that is the case, nothing stops you from appending some other data, borrowing from some other data for some variables. But I will encourage that we use the current secondary data we have as much as possible, because there's a lot to learn from the data we keep collecting. Why keep collecting if we are not learning lessons from what we collect? Then writing for writing's sake or writing for impact. The truth is that by the time you are studying, unless those who are in the physical sciences, but by the time you are studying, doing a PhD, most of the questions are going to be academic in nature. But what matters is your ability to dissect the difficult things you have done for the understanding of the policymaker. Fortunately, for a lot of funding organizations today, before you can access a grant, they want to see your policy, the policy impact of your study. So a number of them require that by the time you even conceive of that study, you should bring in stakeholders who are, essence is that by the time you finish, you should come out with a policy brief which can help in policy formulation and implementation. But at this point, I think what you should worry about, I mean, if an opportunity comes and you can do a study that can easily be, the results of which can easily be implemented for impact, hooray and excellent. But if you do not have that opportunity yet, spend time doing your academic research and doing it well. When you finish and you write the paper, remember, policymakers in actual sense do not have, or they don't have the time to read the kind of academic papers we write. It is usually our responsibility to reduce what we write and publish into a form that is easily digestible. For instance, into policy brief. Doesn't matter how many hundreds of pages your work occupies. For a policy brief that you are writing from that work, usually it shouldn't exceed 3 pages. It's usually 1.5 pages or 2 pages. That way, policymakers can have the time to read and use it. But for now, do not worry so much if you feel you are doing a study which will not be used. You have the ability to make it usable after this. Then you also ask about theories and robustness checks. Is it important? Is it necessary to use so many ways, like the same analysis, you use different approaches. As you rightly mentioned, it's just for robust. So you have the main approach you are using, and you will usually justify why you are using that. What it means is that under the circumstances is the superior one. But you will use others just to check and see whether the results are similar. Remember, for those ones, you usually not report them. You either take them into an appendix, or even if they are on the main paper, you are justifying why, despite them, you are going with the main one. So don't worry. If you try to do robustness checks and another model is giving you different results, already you have a basis and a justification for using the model you are using. So you could explain that away in the light of that superior characteristic you have seen in that model, given your data. Then someone asks a question that whether our literature review should revolve around our research questions. Yes, but note, the advice all the time is that the research questions themselves should even emanate from the literature. Because in discussing your problem or explaining your problem, you will place it in perspective. And how you do that is by looking at the literature. So that then helps you to come up with your research questions. So once that is done, it is just natural that in reviewing the literature, you now do so to revolve around the questions. After all, at the end of the day, these are the questions you want to answer and discuss your results. And discussing your results involves drawing parallels with what is in the literature. Then there is a question on when you are finishing your work and part of the paper is published. I think I mentioned that earlier. Do not worry, because that's not the time that you should restart the work, especially if what you have been, the trump card you have been playing is what the paper is discussing. As we started, we mentioned that when we began, do not worry. What you do is, at that point, you pause, pick up that new paper that has come, study it very well, and you can see, you try to find out what things that are not part of that paper. And you can, in actual sense, you can point out, it doesn't matter how little. Get that, and then you can get going. Otherwise, you might just throw away so many years of work, when in actual sense, in as much as you find similarities, the differences are also pronounced. So at that point, remain sober, read it critically, and find the differences. At that point, what you are interested in is finding the differences, the difference between what you have done and what has come out. After all, you already know that they are similar, but read it with the eye of looking out for the difference. Then there was a question on hypothesis. The last person, if you can repeat that. I just wrote hypothesis, but I don't really know that question was on.
Oh, okay. Thank you very much, Prof. What I was asking is that sometimes you pick a paper, or I mean, you look at some research and realize that they've just converted, they just drew the hypothesis from the research questions or the objectives. I was just trying to ask, I mean, if that is correct.
Sure. Honestly, for a number of my papers, I don't really bother with hypothesis. You see, like I was talking about impact evaluation. If you are writing a paper on an evaluation, that one, you cannot run away from that. You need a hypothesis, because that program you are evaluating had a theory, certain theory of change. So you derive the hypothesis from that, then you go on to test whether that theory, that impact has been achieved or not. But where it is not a typical evaluation thing, and you are doing analysis and using models, I personally find that repetitive, that I turn my objectives into hypothesis, or I set up my model and there are variables, then I now have hypotheses around the variables. After all, by the time I'm discussing my results, I'm actually going to be commenting on whether the variables are playing an important role in explaining the phenomenon I am looking at or not. So be careful. Sometimes it might be repetitive. Avoid that when it's repetitive, but when you need hypothesis, please make use of it. And I just gave you a typical example. Usually in evaluation kind of studies, you cannot run away from bringing studies. You can do without that. Thank you. Eric.
Thank you very much, Prof. Thank you very much, Prof. Honorable members, because of time, I think we will take the last round of questions. We still have some few members to ask questions. So, Mr. Abudu, please, your question.
Thank you, colleagues and Professor Paul. I'm most grateful. Professor Paul was my, lecturer back UDS 2006, 2007, thereabout. Prof, I'm most grateful. Yes, you have impacted lives till now. So may God continue to guide and protect you and give you knowledge in that. So this is a contribution. Prof has already talked about that the intelligence of your thesis or your paper most often is dependent on your contribution. And this is very critical. So most often than not, if we take a topic, we already take that only the topic is a contribution we are making. But you will now get into details and realize that somebody has already done it. Then where then is your contribution again? You have been defeated. Now, most often than not, I think where we should concentrate on is if you yourself is able to come out with a model. If you cannot get a model by yourself, then it means that you cannot contribute to model. Then data is the next thing. Can you contribute to data? For example, if you have a yearly data and what you are going to do, for instance, can be converted into maybe quarterly basis or other kind of, it means that you are contributing to data in that perspective. It is not available. Then this is where your contribution lies. Then we also look at maybe the estimation technique is also one of the areas you can also concentrate on. Within these three areas already talked about, then the other area you can also contribute is what your results. Now, when most often than not, if we want to run like a quantitative kind of sort, we know that maybe when I run my result, I should have a positive, result. But my estimation give me a negative result. Then you are running after how I did not get what I expected. Then this is where, like he was talking about the literature. If our literature you have read, you would have come across somebody got a negative, somebody got a positive. Now, where is the divergence and where is the convergence here is one of the things you have to concentrate on. And if you have gotten a negative, instead of the literature saying positive, what do you think is the reason why you have gotten a positive? Are you able to substantiate that? And per the model you have also used, is that consistent? I think these are just the few areas we can always try to bring contribution to our thesis or our academic papers. So this is just what I want to contribute to, Prof. Thank you so much for the opportunity.
Thank you. Yeah, thank you. Yes,
thank you very much, Mr. Abudu.
I agree. I agree with his submission. Sometimes the contribution might just be that in another field, they keep applying a certain analytical model, which is not common in your. So you could take that and recalibrate that for application in your field, and that could serve as a contribution. So he simply contributed by mentioning the areas where we can look to find the contribution of our study. So thank you, Abudu. Yeah.
Thank you, Professor. Thank you, Mr. Abudu. Mr. Dankwa, please, your question.
Right. Thank you very much. A question, please. Thank you very much, Prof, for the gift you've given us this evening. And thanks to the moderator for the opportunity to ask my questions. Two questions, Prof. Number one.
Okay. Yeah.
Where in your field of study, you see many researchers use, let's say, data on a daily, monthly, quarterly, and rarely yearly basis. And what you are doing, fortunately or unfortunately, the country we come from, even the yearly the getting data on yearly basis is difficult. Now, what do you suggest? Whether we can use that yearly data, because when you look through literature, it is rarely used, or what do we do in that aspect so that at least we can get quite a number of observations to run our model? Then the question number two is on plagiarism. I'm usually confused where some graduate schools or departments request students to publish their work, aspects of their work before they submit their final dissertation. My question is, if my dissertation entails, say, 3 essays, and I've been able to publish, let's say, 2 or all the 3, now, if I bring those things into my work and final dissertation and present, won't the plagiarism software flagged me for plagiarism? Thank you very much.
Okay, welcome.
Thank you, Mr. Dankwa. The last, yes, Prof. Prof, the last question.
Okay.
Okay. Mr. Jumaji, please, before I call you, let me quickly read a question from the chat room, Prof. And this question is from Mr. Karim. He wants to ask that, Prof, how do you manage, or better still, what timeline would you recommend for PhD students with, say, 3 years, but needs to manage literature reviews, research experiments, and publication? What timeline will you recommend for PhD students with, say, 3 years, but needs to manage literature review, research expectations, and publication? And the last question from Mr. Ejumazi. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Prof. Prof, often than not, you hear from some of our colleagues, at least I have heard from about 2 people who have complained about their supervisor, and it's all about superimposing thesis topics on them. And so my question is that, what should be the reaction of such students towards their supervisor, kind of trying to superimpose a thesis topic on them? And then the last one is a situation whereby your supervisor would tell you that he's not having much knowledge about your topic. For instance, my topic, I am doing African philosophy compared with Asian philosophy. I did Asia and African philosophy compared to Western philosophy, but currently I'm doing African philosophy, and I just want to compare it with the Chinese philosophy. But a situation where your supervisor will tell you that he doesn't have much knowledge about African philosophy and all that. He's having, but not much detail. Are you in a safe hand or something? So these are the 2 questions I have for you.
Eric.
Prof.
So can we take, so we can answer this, is that not it?
Yes, please, Prof.
Okay.
This is the last set of questions, Prof.
Okay. The first one was on, in your field, if where they use what's the maybe weekly, monthly, quarterly data. And for instance, in our country, we don't have that. We only have yearly data. Can you go ahead to use that? Honestly, it depends on the data points. How many years, how many data points can you have if you were using the yearly data? Otherwise, you have to adopt other measures, some other models to do some predictions and fill in. Now, you can also attempt to work backwards, where you break down these yearly data, maybe into quarterly data. But again, it depends on the area. For example, in economics, where data points, and you cannot have that rich one. For our country, it's just the annual kind of data. You can go ahead with that, but it depends on how many years the data points. Otherwise, if you do not have enough data points, you may run into degrees of freedom problems, where your parameter estimates might even swallow up your sample size. But so that depends on the area. But once you have so many, even if it's annual data, you have so many years, it shouldn't be a problem. After all, under the circumstances, that is what you can find. But that is definitely a problem. The other is plagiarism, where you are required to publish. See, don't worry about that. Publish your papers. You know that when you are running there are some strainers. Once you have some of the materials published, you're supposed to drop them. If you don't drop them, it will look like you have plagiarized, and the percentage will be very high. But at the point of running the plagiarism, you are supposed to apply the strainers. Drop the papers you have published. Some of those papers will even appear as working papers somewhere before they are published. All of that will be brought in, but you have to drop the strainers. If you cannot do that yourself, get to the library. They will help you on how to screen that. But if you don't and you just run it, I can tell you you're going to have headache. So don't worry with publishing and still running the plagiarism. Then there's this question also on imposition of thesis topic on a student. Yes, we have those exceptional circumstances where supervisors and their students, sometimes there is some misunderstanding. Otherwise, if I want my student to study something, we will discuss it. If the student is not interested, then the student can go. I should be free. The student should be free to want to do what he or she wants to do, especially if the topic I'm giving, there's no funding for it, or the student is simply not interested. It could lead to conflict, but every graduate school has conflict resolution mechanisms. But as graduate students, I would advise that if conflicts are avoidable, avoid that. Engage the supervisor. Try to convince the supervisor why you might not be comfortable being imposed on you. And hopefully that can easily be resolved. It could also be that there are some good things in there for you, but because you are fixated on something else, that is why you are resisting. But once there is a frank discussion on that, you might agree on some common things. Inadequate knowledge of supervisor. The truth is that if your supervisor had all the knowledge on what you were doing, then please, you should not do what you are doing. I remember my major supervisor. He's an Indian. My major supervisor was frank enough to tell me one day, Paul, you know what? This topic you are doing, especially this particular objective, I am handicapped in. I came across it, but I just didn't like it. So please, you are in the driving seat, so you have to carry us along. And what I did was, I had some relevant papers and I did a kind of ranking, and I shared the very important papers with them. And each time we had a meeting, we discussed that, then I'll explain why I was doing what I was doing. Remember, the supervisor is only guiding you. So once the approach and the procedure is right, the knowledge is important, but where it is not there, you should still be able to proceed. Yes, I think that was the last question. So thank you. Eric, over to you.
Thank you very much, Prof. Uh, I'm very much tempted to call Mr. Zacchaeus. I don't know if members and
Yes.
Professor, you permit me
Yes,
to call.
I saw that he put
Thank
up
you.
the hand. You call him. Yeah.
All right, Prof. Mr. Zacchaeus, please, you have the floor.
Oh, thank you so much. There was a question about, in fact, after the time Professor was answering that question, my Wi-Fi fluctuated, so it went off, so I couldn't hear that part, and I was really interested in hearing that. And it's about where part of your thesis have already been published, and then that is likely to contribute to plagiarism in your thesis. So the answer to that, I couldn't hear you because I lost track of the.
Yes. The advice I gave was, when you are running the plagiarism checker, there are, and that is meant for you to drop certain things. One of them is, if you have published a paper and it is part of your thesis, if you put that in the plagiarism checker, it is going to give you a very high rate of similarity index. So there's a way you can drop that paper, because that is your own paper. You should drop it. It should be excluded from that. And I said that if you do not know how to do that, seek help from your library. Once you go there, they will direct you how to do it. And sometimes that alone, you might run it, you have 50 something or 60 something, and that single paper alone is contributing over 80% to the 60 something you have. So strain. But don't say that because of plagiarism, you won't have your paper published. You must publish it. Run the plagiarism checker and drop that one which you have published already. Yeah.
All right. Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Prof. Prof, please, I think there was one question from the chat column.
Oh, okay. Repeat that question. I actually didn't understand the question. Yes. Ask that
Prof.
question.
All right, Prof. I think since Mr. Karim is around, Mr. Karim, please, you can unmute your mic so I can ask your question to the betterment of Prof understanding. Mr. Karim. Mr. Karim?
Hello?
Yeah, you can ask your question.
Yeah, thank you very much, Prof. My question was that say I'm doing PhD and I have 3 years, and in the 3 years I need to do my research study, that's the literature review, and then at the same time do the experiment, and then find some good point to publish a paper. And in our school, the requirement is say publish 3 papers. So I want you to suggest a timeline for me. If let's say normally, the basic thing is to do your literature review, and I have 3 years, and here in China, the Chinese is compulsory, so it's taking 1 year out of my 3 years, and I'm left with 2, and I have to all these things in and then get my certificate. So how do I do this, Prof?
Okay. I wish I had an answer for you to how to effectively do that. But once that problem is there, then you figure out how to resolve it. Fortunately, you should not box yourself and say that I'm spending 1 month on literature review, and for that 1 month, I'm not going to the laboratory to do any experiments. These things should be iterative. Because as you read and review, it even guides you as to how best to handle the experiments you are conducting. Is that not it?
That's
So,
true.
yes. So, in fact, all you need do is, if you are left with 2 years, you have to publish up to 3 papers. See, the problem is that once you send the paper out for review, you have no control over that anymore. So what you can do is maybe you decide that, look, for each of these papers, I will not go beyond 6 months, beyond 8 months on each of them. So if you say you will not go beyond 8 months for each of them, what it means is that in terms of literature, some of them should even overlap, because you can't wait for 8 months you finish paper 1, then 8 months you move to paper 2 in that order. But you should be reviewing literature, conducting experiments, but attempt to give yourself some timelines and see whether you are able to work within those timelines. I wish I had a quick fix. Then I tell you, do it this way or that way. Unfortunately, not. Yeah.
Thank you very much, Prof.
Yeah, welcome. Welcome.
Thank you very much, Professor. You are very much graceful. Honorable members, I think at this point we need to draw the curtains down, and I hope that we've all benefited much from Prof experiences as well as members' contributions. Prof, please, your last word for us before we move on to the next item.
Final words. I am very grateful to all of you for this conversation. That is, we get to reach so many people when we have such conversations. So thank you for the opportunity. And I know the task is not that easy, but it is doable. Apply yourselves to it. And you are out there because of the studies. Just apply yourself to it and you can do it. Let me conclude by sharing my experience. I started my PhD and it was supposed to be strictly 3 years. The first year, things went very well. I had to do coursework. I also had to develop my proposal and came back home to collect data. I collected primary data. I spent 4 months collecting the data. So 1 year, 4 months gone, I was left with 1 year, 8 months. I went back to finish up. Unfortunately, at the time I was going back, I developed a lower back problem. And when I went, I had to join the queue to undergo surgery. So by the time all that was done, I was left with just about a year to finish. I told my supervisor, look, I'm left with just about a year. And remember, I'm not very fit yet. So I want us to inform the university so that I do not have to pay fees if I need to go on extension. You know what my major supervisor told me? He said, Paul, yes, I know. But I know it is doable and you can do it. You have already made so much progress. The rest of it belongs to history. I actually finished and submitted my work before the 12th month. And the following month, which was the 12th month, I had my viva and came back home. So please, you can do it. I wish you well out there. Give it your best shot. And hopefully very soon we should be welcoming you back to join us. And let's see how we develop Mother Ghana together. So thank you for the opportunity once again.
Thank you very much, Professor. Indeed, it is doable. we need to fix ourselves in this situation. Thank you very much, Professor. I will humbly welcome Madam Mavis Amwa to give us the vote of thanks if she's around. Madam Mavis, please, you have the floor.
Yes, and thank you, moderator. I want to thank the executives also for giving me the opportunity to give the votes of thanks. And first of all, I want to thank God for making this program a success. And then secondly, I want to thank our resource person, Professor Paul Kwame Nkegbe, for accepting to be with us and then having this kind of conversation with us. We've learned a lot from his seminar and his speech. Thank you so much, Professor. Thirdly, we want to thank NUGS-CHINA executives, especially President Colin Say and his entourage for gracing this program. We also want to thank the executives of Nugs-Beijing, especially President Johnson Edumazi, and all his able executives for organizing this program for us and giving us this opportunity to learn. We say thank you. Then last but not least, we want to thank all members of NUGS-CHINA and Nugs-Beijing and also all other unions who joined this seminar. Thank you so much. May God bless you. Amen. Thank you.
Amen. 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 Thank you very much, Miss Mavis Amwa. Quickly, I call on Miss Mavis Maslin to give us the closing prayer. Maslin, please, if you are around. Mavis Maslin. Hello, Maslin, please, are you around? Okay, I think. Okay, I think Maslin is facing some natural challenges.
Yes, please.
Oh, okay. Okay, Mavis, you can go ahead.
Okay, please let us pray. Heavenly Father, we thank you for today. We thank you for today's program. We thank you and we bless your name. We pray committing our presented into your hands, and we also pray committing and thanking you especially for us to participate in this particular program. We thank you. We pray that even as we prepare our thesis for master's, PhD, may you be with us and guide us and see us through. We thank you. Bless your name. In Jesus' name we pray. Amen.
Amen. Amen. Thank you very much. Members, please, I will humbly say that the PPT from Professor will be made available to our platform as well as all the national platforms. And also, if you have further questions, you can contact me, myself, or Mr. Demiyako, so that at least we can, or once Professor can leave his email so that if we need further deliberation, we can contact him directly. Thank you very much.